All right. Welcome back to Rockford Reading Daily. I'm not sure what episode this is. It's been about a week since I recorded one. It's been a very tumultuous week for the May 30th Alliance. But here we are, reading Citizens, Cops, and Power, Recognizing the Limits of Community by Steve Herbert. We are on the bottom of page 80, chapter 3, Elusive Legitimacy. And we are... Let's pick up here. The Project of Separation 2, Professionalism and the Expectation of Deference. The drive by state agencies, and especially the police, to separate themselves from the public stems from more than their legal authority. If liberal thought requires a state agency like the police to abide by legal regulations, and thus to be somewhat aloof from the vicissitudes of community pressure, it says very little about how such aloofness might be understood and legitimated by state actors themselves. Even minimal contact with police officers reveals the great extent to which they distinguish themselves from the wider public. They clearly see themselves as members of a unique group. These principal factors fuel their construction of themselves as importantly separate from the citizenry. A desire for protection from community meddling, a felt need for undiminished authority in situations they confront, in part to ensure their own safety, and a hope to attain status via comporting with standards of professional practice. Separation as a means of protection. One afternoon, I was invited to share lunch with a group of officers in the precinct station's lounge. The lunch was prepared by a retired officer who enjoys coming to the precinct to cook a meal for the officers. The prospect of a warm, tasty, and free meal brings them together. I sat down to my plate of beef brisket and was introduced to the other officers at the table. One officer eyed me warily and promptly asked, quote, "Are you a liberal or a conservative?" End quote. I had barely begun to answer when the officer launched into a monologue on the evils of the news media and its love affair with a small number of anti-police political activists. At issue, in particular, was media coverage of some of then recent police shootings of African Americans. These shootings had generated much public criticism. The officer suggested that the media consistently discounted the sensibility of the shootings, most gallingly by not fully reporting the nature of the threat facing the officers involved. Other officers at the table murmured their assent, concurring with the broad argument that the media listens too closely to police critics and thus unfairly impugns the work of the police. On another evening, I was asked to wait for a ride along just inside the precinct station door, in an area where many officers mill about. One officer passed by a few times before stopping and only half-jokingly asking me, quote, "Do you work for the mayor's office?" End quote. He said he thought he saw me reading his name tag. He did not stick around to belabor the issue, but his point was clear. He was wary of the possibility that I could spy on him and use any information I might glean to punish him. On yet another evening, I talked at length with an officer about efforts by some members of the Seattle City Council to conduct research to determine whether SPD officers engaged in, quote, racial profiling, end quote. The council wanted to determine the racial composition of the citizens SPD officers stopped for traffic violations, to determine whether a disproportionate number of those stopped are minorities. The officer was adamantly opposed to such a study, primarily because he distrusted the political motives of the council members. In his view, any such study would be rigged. As he put it, quote, "If the city council wants to find racial profiling, they will find it," end quote. Each of these incidents illustrates a theme that was regularly sounded by the officers I encountered, that they are members of a politically vulnerable institution that can easily suffer the slings and arrows of ill-motivated activists and public officials. Officers expressed considerable fear that public meddling in police affairs will impact them most significantly in terms of punishments. This refrain was consistent, a plaintive wall that the police attract attention from uninformed whiners. These ostensive political operatives allegedly make baseless complaints about the police, thereby making the officers vulnerable to superiors who may sacrifice them to public pressure. Indeed, many officers assess their superiors largely on whether they protect the rank and file from such public pressure. Suspect superiors are castigated as too, quote, political, end quote, to easily lead to punish officers when the public complains. Too easily led to punish officers when the public complains. They want leaders to shield them from such pressure. From their perspective, the public is simply too ignorant to possess any power to determine their fate. The citizenry, many officers allege, can never understand the realities the police face and the necessary tactics they must employ. A police leader's job is thus to keep the public at bay, to insulate the officers from sanctions that might befall them should the public possess meaningful power. In short, the police hope to be not only separate from the public, but actively protected from community intrusion into their affairs. Such intrusion, officers widely believe, can only bring negative consequences, including sanctions against officers whose split-second decisions will be scrutinized by ignorant and biased political activists. Thus, any talk by city council members about racial profiling was seen as pandering to African American activists who seek political benefits through ill-informed police bashing. If their superior officers did not protect them, they would be the fall guys for these machinations. As one officer ruefully observed, quote, shit rolls downhill, end quote. These dynamics fueled a set of political maneuvers by the police officers union in Seattle. The officers were distressed that a new apparatus was established inside the organization to allow non-sworn civilians to investigate citizen complaints. The Office of Professional Accountability is the result of political efforts to provide some external oversight of police actions. The first high-profile case the OPA investigated involved an officer who detained a group of Asian Americans for jaywalking on a downtown street. Those detained alleged that the officers treated them rudely and that he singled them out because of their ethnicity. The OPA rejected the allegation of racial profiling in the incident, but did recommend that the officer be sanctioned for rudeness. The chief of police, less than a year into the job, accepted the OPA's recommendation. That led the rank and file to mobilize a vote expressing, quote, no confidence, end quote, in the chief. The message was clear. The officers expected the chief to protect them from such meddling by citizens and publicly withdrew support from him when he appeared to sway too easily in the political winds. This dramatic and well-publicized effort to highlight their alleged vulnerability to politics illustrates vividly a more pervasive sense in which the police understand themselves as embattled. Anything that smacks of, quote, politics, end quote, is suspect. Any effort in the name of civilian oversight represents an opening through which police opponents can seek the trophy of a punished officer. Because even well-meaning citizens cannot understand the vagaries and the challenges of the job, it hardly makes sense to the typical officer that anyone with an overt political agenda be given influence over police policy and conduct. Instead, the rank-and-file officer, charged with the task of responding quickly to situations where lives may hang in the balance, needs to be shielded from excessive community meddling. Separation from the public is thus understood as an important mechanism of protection. Okay, and then that brings us to a stopping point. And this is something that we have seen take places in Rockford and in Winnebago County as well, too, with police officers and people who support police officers. This feeling that because you're not a police officer or because you haven't engaged in the day-to-day duties of a police officer, somehow that limits your understanding of how police officers should treat people, how police officers should engage in their duties, what the policies and the procedures of police officers should be. And to me, that's another one of these straw man arguments, because 50% of police officers, the other half of that equation, the same way that people have not been in the shoes of police officers, or a civilian may not have been in the shoes of a police officer, it's very rare that a police officer has been on the opposite side of these interactions also. And so they have a inherently biased perspective of these interactions with people because they have not been on the opposite side of them. Another one of the things that we have happened a lot here is that the majority of the police officers that work within Rockford are white. And so they have never dealt with any type of discrimination, any type of racism, or any type of prejudicial policing or any type of prejudicial policies that have been created specifically to target them and the race of people that they are from. And so to only allow 50% of the equation to dictate policy and procedure is, again, is a danger, because it negates the other 50% of the equation. A police officer doing a traffic stop and pulling somebody over, 50% of that is the danger that the police may feel. 50% of that is the things that the police officer may have to engage in and the policy and the procedure of the police officer. But the other 50% of it is the person who feels endangered when they are pulled over by a police officer, is the person who feels vulnerable when they are pulled over by the police officer. And that is 100% of the equation. And too often when policies and procedures are created for police officers, only 50% of the equation is taken into place, and that is the police officer's equation. And again, as it stands, in a city like Rockford, there's 140,000 people in Rockford. There's 306 police officers. So overwhelmingly, there are more citizens who are not police officers than there are citizens who are police officers. So to negate what the majority will experience in an effort to appease the minority, again, is a backwards logic. And I think another one of the things that they pointed out here is this idea that police officers fear being sacrificed or fear being scapegoated, and they want a police officer or they want a police chief or they want superiors that will protect them and will keep them safe. And that's one of the things that we've seen here. Carla Red was a police officer who was just recently promoted to chief of the Rockford Police Department. And last year, Carla Red protected all the police officers who engaged in terroristic actions on May 30th. Outside of District 1, who tased people, who punched people, who kicked people, who falsely arrested people. Carla Red protected those officers by saying that everything that they did was within policy. She was the one who was in charge of the investigation into these things that these officers engaged in, and she provided them cover. And so that was one of the reasons why Carla Red was promoted and was supported by police officers, because they understood that with Carla Red being the chief of police, that they will be provided cover to continue to discriminate, harass, assault, and violate the human rights of citizens in this city. And so, again, I just think it's important that we, as we're reading through these things, we try to draw parallels, and we try to have a deeper understanding of how some of these institutions exist in the way that they exist in 2021. And hold on one second. I want to find where we at. Okay. All right, we're at the middle of page 81. Separation as a means of protection. Excuse me. Sorry. That's what we just read. My fault. Man, that's crazy. I done lost my place. Okay, here we go. Okay. Separation and authority. Bottom of page 83. Another means by which officers seek separation from the public is by experiencing deference to their authority, is by expecting deference to their authority. When they arrive on a scene, the police expect those present to acquiesce to the officer's felt need to dictate the flow of action. They want citizens to obey orders and to comply with requests for information. The police believe they play a unique role in society, and they see their authority as critical to their success in that role. Citizens, in other words, need to recognize the police as a separate and powerful institution and to defer accordingly. In important respects, this desire for unquestioned authority is tied to officers' understandable preoccupation with safety. Given the unpredictable and potentially dangerous nature of some scenes to which they are summoned, officers sensibly hope to gain quick control amid chaos. Such successful dominion can thus reduce the possibility of danger. This functional connection between authority and safety is one I explore more in Chapter 4. The important point to stress here is that a principal source of the separation the police construct between themselves and the citizenry is their desire for deference to their authority. For example, in the story cited earlier of the man on the paths of the park known for illicit sexual encounters, the officer was quite distressed that the man initially sought to elude him. He berated the man for walking away, reminding him that it was, quote, a good idea, end quote, to comply with the police request for a conversation. Another officer told me he derived great satisfaction from his job because, as he put it, quote, I like to win. I don't win them all, but I do win most of them, end quote. This officer is confident that, eventually, his authority will emerge triumphant, and he exults in that reality. Indeed, the police regularly invoke their superior tactics and their capacity to exercise coercive force in describing their work. One officer described an encounter that occurred at a roll call attended by the mayor shortly before the World Trade Organization Ministerial Conference in 1999. According to the officer, the mayor attended roll call to urge restraint in the face of expected protesters. The officers responded derisively and suggested to the mayor that he was underestimating the threat the protesters would pose to public order. The mayor reportedly bristled at these remarks, a reality that the officer dismissed. He said, quote, we have guns, we aren't bashful. Don't come into our station and expect us to shut up, end quote. Another sergeant evinced much the same logic in concluding a dissection of an encounter I had just witnessed, wherein he negotiated a standoff between a shop owner and a towing company. The shop owner had parked his car in front of a fire hydrant near his shop, a violation that could be punished with an immediate towing. A traffic officer had ticketed the car and summoned the tow company with which the city contracts. When the tow truck arrived, the shop owner hurried out to his car and occupied it. The truck operator stopped the tow and called the police because they would not tow the car with the owner inside. When they arrived, the police were told by the shop owner that he suffered from a heart condition and thus any effort to remove him forcefully might cause a heart attack. For their part, the tow operators were unwilling to unhook the car without receiving payment from the car owner. The sergeant artfully negotiated a compromise, whereby the shop owner agreed to pay a reduced fee in exchange for the cessation of the tow. The sergeant explained his reasoning for seeking an amicable solution. Quote, we try to avoid a fight, but if they really want to fight, we'll fight, end quote. At the limit, then, the police recognize their need to prevail and will physically enforce that authority if necessary. Their understandable preference is for their authority to be immediately recognized and deferred to. Absent such deference, officers will assert their authority as they see fit. They recognize themselves as distinct and separate from the citizenry, possessors of a unique source of power that will be hegemonic. And then that brings us to another stopping point. I think the thing that stands out to me the most from that situation is how often we have had encounters with police officers where they simply believe just by their presence that they are dictators, that they can and fascists, and that they can dictate how fast you breathe. They can dictate whether you stand or whether you sit. They can dictate whether you blink or whether you don't blink. And again, I'm getting into hyperbole a little bit here, but an event that comes to mind is there was a man. It was I don't know if it was a man or not, but somebody drove by City Hall. They were driving erratically, and in the midst of them driving erratically, they hit a flower pot that was, and it's a big flower pot, but they hit this big flower pot, knocked the flower pot over. Within 5 minutes, the police department, 2 police officers from the Rockford Police Department came downtown to City Hall. Me and another member of the May 30th Alliance, Rabbit, were outside of City Hall, as we have been for the past 400 plus days. And they came, asked me about the flower pot. I told them I didn't know what happened, which I have every right to say that I don't know what happened. You don't have any legal obligation to tell the police officers anything when they come onto a scene, which is, again, something that should be reminded and something that should be remembered, that you have the legal right to remain silent. These police officers tend to try to use intimidation to get you to bypass that right, but that is a right that you have. And so I told him I didn't see anything. The officer then asked me for my ID. I told him I didn't have an ID. He asked me for my name, and I told him that he knew what my name was. I was aware that the officer knew who I was, knew what my name was. And so we were really just having a pissing contest. He was trying to exert his authority, exert his dominion, and I understood that's what he was trying to do. And I knew I had not been involved in any legal activities, and so I wasn't going to be his whipping boy for the evening. That would lead to the police officer, once I said I didn't have an ID and I didn't give him my name, to him handcuffing me and putting me in the back of a car. Again, through this whole time, this officer came down here about a flower pot that had been knocked over. There were tire tracks leading right up to the flower pot. So within any type of investigation into what he should have been there for, he would have shortly realized that a car hit the flower pot. I had been standing out there. I did not have a car, so I could not have been the culprit in this case. But again, this police officer was coming to exert his authority. Besides that, I'm already a target. That one of the things that they had pointed out here earlier in one of these sections is the disdain that a Seattle police officer had for the attention that anti-police protesters were getting, and for the attention that people, that victims of police shootings were getting. And that is something that I have actively been a part of, trying to raise awareness to these 21st century lynchings that the Rockford Police Department engages in, that all police engage in. For the past 5 years, 1,000 people a year are killed by the police in this country. That's 3 people on average a day. Shot and killed by that, and that separates how many people are killed by ICE, or die in jail custody, or die in prison custody, or die later from or have heart attacks and strokes within the jails, or commit suicide within jails based on the conditions that these things have. And so this institution is a institution of death, an institution of violence. And so that light needs to be shined upon these things for us to get away from that type of for us to uproot these type of institutions that are pervasive with violence and pervasive with death. But what trying to bring attention to that issue it does, and what trying to uproot this type of violent institution does, is it harnesses the animosity of these police officers. And so they then, when they have the opportunity, try to exert some type of authority, or use some type of intimidation to the people who they know are trying to shine light onto these things. And so I was arrested, sat in the back of a cop car. Rabbit was also handcuffed and arrested, sat in the back of a cop car until eventually a superior officer would come. We would be unhandcuffed. They would put crime scene tape around this flower pot as if this was a dead body in the streets or something like that. And then I'm sure that they would later on watch the tapes that was at City Hall, see that we had nothing to do with the flower pot being knocked over. The city workers came, picked the flower pot up the next morning. But I brought those things up to say that in that situation, this police officer, it was secondary to figure out what happened to this flower pot. It was secondary to deal with what he specifically had been called there to deal with and to investigate. The primary thing for him was to exert control. His primary thing for him was to come onto the scene and to let it be known that everything was in his jurisdiction, and that what he said went, and it was his way or the highway. And if he said jump, you better ask how high. And we have to get to a place where, as citizens, we not only understand that is not how policing works, but also that is allowing these officers to do this. Each time that somebody allows an officer to do this, it gets them to manifest these microaggressions. It gets them closer and closer to a macro aggression of police terrorism taking place. I think we got enough time to knock out one more section. Separation and professionalism. Beyond their adherence to the law, then, the police reinforce a sense of distinction between themselves and the public by seeking protection from excessive political intrusion into their affairs, and by embracing a self-construction as authoritative actors. An additional source of separation comes through the prestige associated with the status of a professional. Recall that the idea for police organizations that preceded community policing, the professional model, stressed the unique basis of expertise the police could mobilize to reduce crime. The police sought to make themselves analogous to other high-status occupations. Just like doctors and lawyers are specially educated, so were police officers trained according to high standards that ensured an efficient workplace. This was tied to the effort to wage an effective war against crime. Because of their superior tactics, the police would consistently outwit criminals and therefore deter future criminality. Even if one could argue that community policing has supplanted the professional model, the notion of the police as possessors of unique expertise clearly persists, and for officers, this expertise reinforces a distinction between themselves and the public. For example, during a ride-along, a dispatcher asked an officer to respond to a citizen complaint about a group of men who were selling drugs on a street corner. The officer dismissed the call because the citizen, quote, had not been trained, end quote, to detect drug sales. It would therefore likely be a waste of his time to respond. Another officer I accompanied observed a group of young men dispersing from a street corner as his cruiser drove past. This was a significant phenomenon, he asserted, one that only a, quote, trained police officer, end quote, would notice. Their dispersal, he argues, is a clear signal that they are, quote, up to no good, end quote. Why else, he wonders, would they be dispersing? This notion of professional separation was reinforced subtly by This notion of professional separation was reinforced subtly but powerfully at police community forums. Each conversation between officers and members of the public focused on some matter related to crime and disorder. In each case, the officers controlled the conversation, reserved for themselves the last word, and discussed, often at length, the various measures they would take to address the issue at hand. If there were any obstacles to the police's effectiveness, these were invariably matters beyond police control. A too lax system of punishment, an unresponsive bureaucracy, the delicate politics of arrest of homosexuals. In short, the police reinforced the notion of themselves as the expert professionals able to deploy their unique set of knowledge, skills, and tactics to solve a problem beyond the scope of an ordinary citizen to confront. In sum, then, the police construct themselves as a separate and powerful social group and legitimate distinction in potent and reinforcing ways. They are legal actors with allegiance to the legal code. They are members of a politically vulnerable group that deserves protection from ill-informed public meddling. They possess an authority to control situations to which the public should defer. They command a unique base of knowledge and thus deserve an elevated professional status. From this position of separation from the public, it is obviously difficult for police to approach the citizenry as fully vested, quote, partners, end quote, with whom they can, quote, co-produce, end quote, strategies for crime reduction. In this way, subservience is limited by separation. And then that brings us to a stopping of that passage and to the last part of chapter 3, which I believe we'll be able to finish in the next episode. I think that one of the main things that is standing out here from this chapter 3 of elusive legitimacy is just that, all of the things that when you dissect them deeper, when you look past just the surface level, all of the things that hinder policing being legitimated by citizens, being legitimated by communities, being legitimated by neighborhoods. One of the examples that they gave there is that a police officer wouldn't go to see if drugs were being sold in an area after somebody called because the police officer didn't believe that this citizen knew how to identify drugs being sold. Whereas when another officer seen kids dispersed from a police car that turned around the street, this officer made it seem like this was the most subtle action that was being taken, and that only a police officer would think or would notice them dispersing from in front of the car, and also that them dispersing in front of a police car meant that they were doing something that was illegal. And even this notion that being up to no good is the same thing as doing something that is illegal. And I think that that's one of the things that we we often have a problem with as a community and as citizens is not understanding what is legal and what is illegal, not understanding what is against the law and what isn't against the law, the concept of being innocent until proven guilty. And these are all things that are in the policies, the procedures of police departments. These are all things which are purposefully sort of neglected. The information is purposely neglected to be given to the community. The police do not go out of their way, like they said here, to co-produce or to be partners with members of the community, even though policing at its core cannot even take place or work without some type of community co-production. It's just that a lot of times that co-production is from specific members of the community or from specific individuals in the community who are in a position where they don't usually deal with policing a lot. So they don't have any problem with, and the police don't have any problem with sitting down and dealing with somebody who supports police, somebody who lives in an area where there's not a lot of police at, giving information or giving opinions on how policing should work or what things should be done differently. A lot of times the place where they have an issue with somebody giving opinions or somebody saying how things should or shouldn't be done is when it is with people in a community that deals with the police regularly, that understands the police at a different type of a capacity. And I think that is one of the things that we have to, that I'm also pulling away from this when we start to speak about legitimacy, that the people who don't deal with police often and don't deal with the residual effects of policing often, those are the people who see police as the most legitimate option disproportionately, whereas people who deal with these police officers regularly, who deal with the things that these policies and procedures, the residual effects of these things, those are the people who policing is illegitimate to. And so I'm gonna, like I said, I haven't done this in about a week, so I'm a little rough with trying to add my own perspective and trying to tie some of these things back to Rockford, Illinois. So thank you for being with me through this episode. New episode will be out tomorrow. We'll finish chapter 3 tomorrow and begin with chapter 4. And I think we got about 2 or 3 chapters left in this book. This has been a very good read. It's a lot forced me to grapple with concepts that I've never really grappled with before. And this chapter right here has forced me to grapple in the struggle with the concept of legitimacy, police legitimacy. So I want to thank you for taking the time to listen. Please share this on whatever streaming platform you are listening to it on. Remember, the May 30th Alliance is on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, YouTube. Go follow, subscribe, TikTok, all of those things. And we put these episodes out on a daily basis to give everybody an opportunity every day to begin on their journey to struggle against police terrorism, mass incarceration, and racial injustice, or to further their journey to struggle against police terrorism, mass incarceration, and racial injustice. We outside.